The latest evidence from an inquiry into British media ethics doesn't necessarily paint the country's tabloid culture in the best light. On Monday, Kelvin Mackenzie, the former editor of The Sun, told the probe that the newspaper did not really have a regard for issues such as privacy. His comments echo those from many other journalists to appear before the so-called Leveson Inquiry into media ethics, and suggest that Britain's tabloid press was out of control. The probe responds to revelations that News of the World reporters hacked into the mobile phone of a murdered schoolgirl, Millie Dowler, in 2002. Journalists from that paper, part of Rupert Murdoch's media empire, had hitherto focused such tactics on celebrities. Steve Coogan, a comedian, complained about tawdry muckraking and his mistreatment at the hands of sociopathic editors. The actor Hugh Grant said phone hacking and other outrages were practiced not just by News of the World, which has been forced to close, but other papers also. The inquiry has illuminated a murky world in which private detectives dig up dirt and police get backhanders in exchange for tip-offs. But what options are on the table for Lord Justice Leveson when he publishes his recommendations later this year? He is expected to call for stronger press regulation by beefing up the industry's self-regulating body, the Press Complaints Commission. But any attempt to place legislative curbs on perhaps the world's most vociferous and free press are likely to be resisted. Newspaper editors have already argued against European-style rules against photographing celebrities in public without their consent. They say that those in the public eye can and should be scrutinised. Exposing private vices is in the public interest. To probe Leveson's conundrum, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Tim Gopsill from the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, Simon Davies, the director of the advocacy group Privacy International, and Dr Daithí Mac Síthigh, a media expert at the University of East Anglia. First question to you, Simon. On Monday, Kelvin Mackenzie said The Sun did not really have regard for privacy issues when he was editor. Does that tell us anything new?
No, it doesn't. It's the worst-kept secret in the media world that the British tabloid press declared open season on privacy 20 years ago. And in fact, if you look back, and I know this is all forgotten wisdom because it's pre-internet, but Australia had an independent commission of inquiry into the corrupt disclosure of information, and we're going back now to 1992, 1993. That inquiry showed wholesale, widespread abuse of information. The media were up to their necks in it. There were third-party brokers. The police got the backhanders that this inquiry is looking at. And there was a massive industry of information brokers, as I say, with the media on one side, the police on one side, and industry on the other. Now, we knew this to be true, and anybody working in the tabloid press in Britain knew that one of the deals is you get the story at any cost, just don't tell us how you did it. And people were encouraged, and are continuing to be encouraged, to use all sorts of innovative and creative means to get that information.
Tim, hacking into the voicemail of a dead schoolgirl, what had gone so wrong with the British press for journalists to do that back in 2002?
Well, they were, as you've said, completely out of control. And what's missing is not laws to stop people doing it, but a sense of responsibility among the journalists, particularly the recognition of the concept of the public interest. There is nothing intrinsically necessarily wrong with hacking people's voicemail. It can be justified if you're conducting an investigation into corruption or some other kind of wrongdoing. What is wrong is the lack of application of the public interest. In other words, that it must be absolutely necessary for the public to be informed with the information for it to happen. That's where they went wrong. They lost that.
Tim, I just nearly fell off my chair when you said this. There is nothing wrong with hacking phones. I mean, surely it's up to the police and the courts to determine whether it's in the public interest, and surely it's the police that should conduct those.
Well, where we are at the moment with the press is because of investigations that happened in The Guardian into the goings-on at News International. If it hadn't been for those investigations, we wouldn't be where we are. Now, the investigations editor of The Guardian, David Lee, has said that on occasions he has used secret voicemail information as part of his investigations into British aerospace corruption with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but
that's justified.
There's no guidelines. There's no transparency or accountability. Isn't this part of the problem? We've just let the media run free and declare what the parameters of an investigation should be.
The guidelines are the journalist's own sense of responsibility. That's what I said that they need. That's where they went wrong. They did go wrong, but it's up to journalists to correct it, not the state.
Daithí, can I bring you in here over whether or not there is actually anything wrong with phone hacking?
Well, I mean, one of the problems that the inquiry has dealt with is that the legal position is very muddled. There can be differences, for example, as to listening to a voicemail before the intended recipient had heard it or afterwards. Something appeared to turn on that. There may be distinctions between listening to a voicemail and other forms of investigative journalism. There are a number of public interest defences in law, although they are not necessarily consistent with one another. But what Tim says is correct. Within the parameters of freedom of expression, you can contemplate a situation where something that would be generally prohibited by the law would have a defence that you could put, for example, before a court. You could say that this would be a breach of the law, however it was justified by particular circumstances. What we've seen over the last couple of months' worth of revelations, that some of those internal controls as to when particular tactics should be used were not in place. We've seen changes over the last decade and more within the role of the National Union of Journalists, which has its own code of conduct. But the union isn't necessarily recognised by all editors and publishers. So those types of controls, where the ethical role is mixed with the strict legal provisions, they have been lacking in some ways. But clearly, press freedom and the freedom to investigate is important. That what we would hope would come out of the inquiry would be clearer provisions as to when intrusion is appropriate. Not to say that it is simply the judgment call of an editor based on how many copies of a paper they can sell, but to establish a genuine public interest test.
But it's Simon here, but isn't part of the problem that Parliament has run scared on the subject of press regulation for decades? I know I used to be secretary of the all-party parliamentary group on privacy, and I recall numerous calls, this is during the Blair administration, from MPs saying, look, I'll join, but please never touch the media privacy issue. I don't want to be attacked by the News of the World or the Sun. Isn't the biggest problem that in the absence of a regulatory system, like a press regulator, and scared politicians, we really do still have a lawless territory?
The sad thing about the privacy debate in the UK, and Simon, of course, is very aware of this, is how it gets picked up by some public representatives as being the worst possible thing to talk about, because A, it may upset the media, and B, aspects of it are European in origin, and for some members of Parliament, that's just territory they do not want to go into. Now, what I would say in a more optimistic sense is, although there have clearly been bad practices at a number of newspapers, and although it is quite distressing to hear the testimony of affected individuals, the benefit, if we can point to one, is that there is now a more open conversation going on about press regulation. If we go back a couple of years when the Human Rights Act was being introduced in the UK, which gave force to the European Convention on Human Rights, there was such a discussion then about, we can't do anything to upset the press and we have to be careful about the Press Complaints Commission. Now these issues are back on the table. The PCC itself is being debated. And as a self-regulatory body, which doesn't necessarily have the controls and legitimacy of other regulators, this is a golden opportunity to discuss both privacy and freedom of expression, and not to have a situation where, as you point out, members of Parliament are terrified to discuss the media because of the ramifications. This is a chance.
It's not a problem that the government and Parliament have been terrified to interfere with the media. I don't think they should interfere with the media. The problem actually that we have at the moment, you referred to the European laws, is that high-profile celebrity and wealthy people are using the European laws on privacy to censor the press, and there have been a whole series of court cases in which people who have either been or think they're about to be written about in the media have gone to court and got stories stopped on the grounds of privacy, which is in fact interference with freedom of expression and free reporting in the press. That's the problem we've had.
Yeah, but there's an even more murky story that's going to emerge. Okay, I'll make the bet right here on Voice of Russia. The same information brokers and private investigators that have been used by the tabloid media have been used by the political parties. That's one of the reasons why politicians run scared. They know they've been up to the same tricks that the Sun and the News of the World have been up to. That's yet to emerge, but believe me, that is going to be the big one when it does.
The other people who are at fault here are the police. Now, where you've had this trade with ex-coppers mainly working as detectives, which is private detectives, which is what the police do when they take early retirement and make lots of money selling private information to the press. Now, in that trade of information that's been going on, it's much more serious what the police have been doing than what the journalists have been doing, because the journalist's job is to root out information in any way that they can. The police's job is supposed to be to follow the rules and be absolutely straight. I'm much more worried about the police than I am about the journalists.
Exactly right. And that was the Australian inquiry. That's what it determined. There was an army of ex-cops, sometimes cops who had been dismissed disgracefully, that had set up as private investigators, and they had no limits on their level of intrusion.
It's not all the information. It's not all coming from phone hacks. Most of it is bought from bent coppers.
Daithí, the debate was framed quite neatly by Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister, when he spoke of the need to draw a line between public interest on the one hand and vulgar voyeurism on the other. Is it possible to strike a balance?
Well, it's not as easy as it might be made out to be. I mean, vulgar voyeurism, for whatever we may say about it, is clearly part of the vibrancy of freedom of expression, and there is a danger of trying to separate the world into good speech and bad speech, because that's fine if I'm the one making that decision. I would have an idea of what I would constitute good speech, but that power exercised by public authorities or by courts can be very damaging. To say that something is not in the public interest because it's controversial, say, or because it might disturb an economic issue. You can see there are many people who would say prying into the affairs of a company or a political party is merely voyeuristic, whereas others would say no, that's a very important part of social debate. Now, where I think we have made some progress is in allowing issues to be debated before the courts. And it's not to say the courts are without blame in this affair either, but even regarding injunctions and so-called super injunctions, I think even over the last couple of months we've seen a little bit of a pushback where applications that, in my mind, did go too far regarding imposition on freedom of expression have been fought and have been contested, and there has been some successes within that. So rather than try and establish a clear, bright line rule in advance that you can determine every situation, it may be more appropriate to have transparency and to have a forum where issues can be debated or resolved. But of course, there are dangers there, and I think Tim highlighted it quite well in that there is genuine reason to be suspicious of a public authority that purports to regulate the press. But what we have at the moment is public authorities standing back and powerful proprietors affecting the nature of debate, be it political or voyeuristic or both, that takes place within the UK.
Tim, how do you achieve the balance? Are you looking at something like a beefed-up self-regulatory body, or does the press need statutory regulation, like Ofcom, the regulator of broadcasters?
I take as my authority on this the journalist who did all the investigating at The Guardian, Nick Davies. He's a very distinguished and a very able and determined journalist, and he said in evidence to this inquiry that's running at the moment, the British media are incapable of self-regulation because they are too powerful, and you do have to have a system that has some kind of statutory backup at some level, not in the state making laws about the press, not in any kind of government interference or censorship or anything like that, but a self-regulatory system which has the force of law behind it, so that the self-regulatory body, if it penalises a media, then it can make them publish a correction or a fine or whatever else you want. You do need that, because the self-regulatory system has been proved now not to work without some kind of backup.
Daithí, do you agree? Can the freedom of the press be protected under a format of statutory regulation?
Yes, it can. One of the problems with the first stages of this debate, and I think this was an issue at the start of the inquiry, was the supposition that there was that you could have one or the other. You could either have the current system under the PCC, or you could have almost sort of direct ministerial control of what goes on within the media. And I think what's emerging now is that the debate is much more nuanced than that. In my own evidence to the inquiry, I discussed a number of models where you would have recognition of decisions by the state or enforceability without having direct political involvement or having a statutory guarantee of independent regulation. The PCC, of course, is not an independent regulator because it is the code itself is developed by editors. It is a useful code. It's more the structures that would need to be built upon there. But it is clearly possible, and we have seen in areas of cinema, broadcasting, and so on, how regulatory models that may have started in a more censorious fashion have developed. Now, they're not perfect either, and there's certainly more work you could do to improve the Ofcom system, but there are plenty of newspaper proprietors who are more than happy to accept Ofcom regulation when it comes to satellite television channels. There are newspaper proprietors who accept hybrid systems of regulation in other member states of the European Union because it's simply the way that it's done there. So you look at press councils in Denmark or in Ireland, where you have different types of structures than you would have in the UK Press Complaints Commission, and it's the same proprietors accept it. So they say in the UK this is a line that shall never be crossed, but then they're quite happy to cross it when it comes to broadcasting or when it comes to foreign press councils. So I think it is possible to build on the PCC to have something that is more independent, more transparent, and ultimately more enforceable without having a situation where you hand over press regulation to agents of the state. That would not be appropriate.
Simon, we've been talking about penalties. In your opinion, what would this be like on the ground? Should the regulator be able to impose fines against a newspaper that, for example, may not be making any money anyway?
I think this comes down to accountability, and what I have to say, sort of put the cards on the table straight off. No responsible privacy organisation can function in a free society without having equal regard to free speech and free expression by the media. The two are equal and compatible rights, but they're also responsibilities. So what I would argue, rather than sort of going down the route of penalties, is we have to bring to account the people who are responsible for privacy invasion. So, for example, at the moment, editors of these newspapers or broadcasters can shrug their shoulders and say, well, it ain't me, Gov. I wasn't responsible. I didn't know. I just happened to be in control. No. I think let's have a tighter, more focused, more specific set of regulations, codes, if you like. I don't mind if we have that, provided the people responsible for them are brought to account and are brought heavily to account if things go wrong.
Everyone's gunning for the newspapers at the moment, but what you have to be careful not to do is to disturb the culture of the British media. There's a lot of very good media in Britain. We have a very healthy and robust media culture. It's questioning of government, it's questioning of people in authority and people in the public eye, and that's good. We have very high media consumption in Britain. We talked all the time about the journalists. We should also be talking about the readers and viewers who value what they get. I mean, newspapers have very high circulation, TV and radio, very high listenership. The British media are very popular, and the culture of the British media has always been that you have a regulated broadcasting sector which is licensed and everybody agrees should be regulated in the public service concept, and then you have a completely independent media. The strength of British journalism is the combination of those two. You can't interfere. If you interfere with that, you're in trouble. You can't put state regulation, broadcasting type regulation on newspapers. It just won't work. What you've got to try and do is keep that balance.
We've spoken about the strength of the newspaper industry here, and I think the Leveson Inquiry is going to see a bit more of a fight back from the newspaper editors against the kind of regulation that you've been discussing. At the end of the day, when Leveson is filing his final report, are you expecting to see anything but the most minor tinkering with the current system? Daithí?
Well, the inquiry has a long way left to run, and I know Others in this debate have touched upon the role of the police, for example, which the inquiry is going to be looking at. I think in about a month's time it's starting that phase. So it's far too early to say what the report would look like when it hasn't started, when it's only heard one of its four key components. Now, there is a feeling, and I think a number of other inquiry witnesses were of this view, that the inquiry was turning into something more like a royal commission, where recommendations would be made regarding the general culture of the media, rather than simply try to solve who did what, where and when. There are a number of issues that go beyond the strict parameters of the original questions around how the press is funded, how journalists are trained. So it is looking, from my view, on the margins of it, that this is going to be quite a substantial work, and it will be more of the nature of a report on the press and its future instead of a fact-finding exercise. But there's an awful lot more left to come, and we've seen this week, for example, the evidence being given by people who've worked for The Sun and other tabloid newspapers in the UK, and they clearly have a lot to say. And I think what Lord Justice Leveson is doing is taking on a lot of these perspectives and then trying to put them all together. I know the fourth phase of the inquiry will be about recommendations, but we're only coming to the end of phase one at the moment.
Simon, do you expect to see substantial changes?
I don't think substantial. I think a couple of things are going to come out of this. First will be probably a law tightly governing private investigators, very tightly governing private investigators, and also establishing a filter on who can go into the industry. That is to be welcomed. But I think that in terms of the media, I think what we're going to end up is a sort of hybrid of ethics courses, accreditation on ethical journalism, more training, more development of the sort of culture, a positive culture that Tim talks about. And finally, I suspect there's going to be a witch hunt amongst the police. I think that a big focus will be on the police and their role in this. And what you'll probably see is a strengthening of the Independent Police Complaints Commission and some more resources for that body. That's my tip.
Tim, ethics courses for journalists, but the police carrying the can.
Ethics courses aren't worth the time they're spent on, are they, really? I mean, you can't teach ethics in a classroom. In the days when the press was a little bit less outrageous than it was, journalists were trained in-house, they went to apprentices, they were trained by their peers, they didn't learn at university, and those were healthier times. I don't think the inquiry is going to go as far as some people would like, especially the celebrities who want to put tight. I'm afraid as far as the celebrities are concerned, they're going to have to get used to journalists and photographers camping outside their door. That is just going to happen. It is really for the media themselves to sort it out. We are hoping that they will have learnt some kind of lesson from this. Not too hopeful, but give them some kind of backing to be able to regulate themselves better.
And as Daithí says, it's still quite a long way to go before Leveson comes back with his report. Thanks for joining us. I was joined by Tim Gopsill from the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, Simon Davies, the director of the advocacy group Privacy International, and Dr Daithí Mac Síthigh, a media specialist at the University of East Anglia.